So today's lecture, we're going to be discussing bone function. We are also going to be looking at bone composition, bone structure, and we're going to talk about bone development and homeostasis. So let's go ahead and get started discussing some of the functions of our bones. So the five main functions that our skeletal system serves. One is support, which we've discussed. It supports the body, it keeps us upright, it supports our organs. And then, of course, protection. We know that a lot of our vital organs are found within the walls of our skeleton. Our skeletal system is also designed so that we can move around. Our appendicular skeleton allows us to be able to move, manipulate our body. Also, even the way that our vertebral column is formed allows us to stay upright when we walk. Our bones are also a big mineral storage area. That's why individuals who don't have a proper diet, a lot of times their skeletal system will suffer because our bodies will draw from our skeletal system to get the nutrients that it needs. Also, our bone marrow is responsible for blood cell formation, which is also a very important function. We'll talk about in a few minutes how our bones are vascular and blood vessels run all throughout the bones, picking up blood cells that are made within that bone marrow. So let's talk a little bit about how our bones are put together. So bones are organs. So if anyone ever asks you, name an organ of the skeletal system or what is an organ, you would obviously say the bones. The bones are made of osseous tissue, which we learned about in Unit 2. Osseous tissue, of course, is bone tissue. It also has nerves, so there's nervous tissue. There's cartilage surrounding a lot of the bones. And then muscle is attached to the bone. And then we also have some epithelial tissue, because remember, epithelial tissue lines a lot of our cavities. And so lots of tissue found within the bones. Every bone has a very dense outer layer that looks very smooth, and it feels smooth to the touch. It's very solid, and we call that compact bone. Within the bone, you find almost like a honeycomb. Teachers, for our virtual students who are going through to get lunch, they will be ready for them at 10:45. The virtual students who need lunch, they will be ready at 10:45. Sorry about that. So within the bone, you will find a bone marrow that is called spongy bone. And that's where we'll find our red and yellow bone marrow. And it's called the trabeculae. And it looks like a sponge when you look at it. So our long bones have two main parts. The shaft, or the long part of the bone, is known as the diaphysis. That is going to surround our marrow cavity. And so inside the diaphysis, there's almost like a little tunnel, and that tunnel is where our marrow would be found. For adults, our marrow cavity or medullary cavity houses yellow marrow. For babies, we find out that they have red marrow in their cavities, but as you age, that cavity changes and becomes less red marrow and mainly yellow marrow. And for adults, red marrow is only found in certain places. On the ends of the bones, which, are those typical curvy ends that we think of when we think of a bone, we find our epiphyses. So these are covered in cartilage. You've seen it before if you've ever eaten like a chicken leg or a drumstick. At the end of it, you'll see that kind of a glassy, chewy substance. That is hyaline cartilage. So you have the same thing. If we were to, make a drumstick out of your leg, when we got to the end of it, we would find that same cap of cartilage on the end. Between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, we find a very faint line that is known as the epiphyseal line. This epiphyseal line is known as the growth plate. And when you were little and you were going through those large spurts of growth, it was happening at that growth plate. As you age and as you begin to stop growing, that plate changes just to a line. And they can actually use x-rays and look at that epiphyseal line to see the growth plate. And I'm actually going to put some pictures that you'll be able to see in the classroom of growth plates from my son when he bruised his hand and we had it x-rayed. And since he was a child, you can really see these growth plates. So our bones lengthened from that particular area. So here's a picture of the bone. So this head of the bone and this head of the bone, we call those the epiphysis. Okay, so that's the bone ends. This long shaft of the bone, that's the diaphysis. And you can see that inside there is a marrow cavity known as the medullary cavity. And that's what's going to house for us that yellow marrow. Right here, this little faint line, that's the growth plate, the epiphyseal line. And remember, while we were still growing, that line, that was a separation almost because it was cartilage at that area. As it turns to bone, when you look at it under the microscope or look at it in an x-ray, you just see kind of this line on the x-ray. But for children, it's almost like a space there, and it's because that's cartilage. And then here's that articular cartilage around the heads of the bones, which kind of serve as a cushion for those long bones. You can see they've zoomed in right here so you can see what it looks like. And then once again, remember, bone is vascular, so there's blood vessels running all throughout it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what this covering is in just a few minutes. So that's the structure of a long bone. So as we're going through this, feel free to pull up that PowerPoint in the Google Classroom, and you can look at these a little bit more closely as we're talking about some of these structures within a bone. So for bones, long bones have a membrane around them that is known as the periosteum, and it covers the whole bone. And I just showed you a picture of it. So the periosteum is going to have a lot of nerve fibers. There's going to be lymphatic vessels, which we know pick up fluid and they help with cleaning up areas. And then there's going to be blood vessels. That's why when you break a bone, it hurts and you usually develop a bruise. It's because the periosteum is also damaged. And so that periosteum is going to leak blood, it's going to hurt, and it's going to swell in that area. So when we break a bone, usually it's the tissue around it that's also injured and becomes very inflamed. Now, for short, irregular, and flat bones, they're a little different. They are obviously not going to have a shaft and ends on them because of their size or because of their shape. So in flat bones, they do have spongy bone, but instead of being called the marrow cavity or medullary cavity, we call it the diploe. And it's just this little, it almost looks like the peanut butter sandwich between two pieces of bread. And I'm going to show you a picture of it in just a second. For short, irregular, and flat bones, some of the things that they share is they also have a periosteum, and it covers the outside of the compact bone, and that's going to deliver nutrients to the osseous tissue within the bone. It's going to pick up waste, things like that. It also has on the inside a cavity that's covered in an epithelial tissue known as endosteum, and this covers the spongy bone on the inside and protects it as well, just another layer of protection. And they don't have a marrow cavity, obviously, because flat bones are going to be flat. They don't have that rounded shaft, but they do have marrow. And instead, it's just kind of sandwiched in between in the diploe. And here's a picture of some flat bone from the skull. And you can see here's the outer layer. That's going to be your compact bone. And here's the spongy bone. See, it looks like a sponge known as the diploe. And it's going to be housed, there will be a little thin layer of tissue on the inside known as the endosteum. And around the outside, you'll find the periosteum. So hematopoietic tissue is baby blood cells. Basically, this is what makes blood for us. So for long bones, we find it in the spongy bone. In flat bones, we find it in the diploe. For newborns, so babies, you're going to find the only marrow that they have is red marrow. And as you get older and older and older, your red marrow changes. It's no longer red marrow. Instead, you begin to make yellow marrow. And yellow marrow is going to have a lot of fatty components to it. which is used for nourishment, and it's also used by our skeletal system and our body for various things. So as you get older, the red marrow changes and it becomes yellow marrow. And what happens is the red marrow gets pushed to the heads. So the head of your femur, which would be your thigh bone, and your humerus, which is your long bone. And so an individual who is going to donate bone marrow, they donate red marrow because red marrow is what we use to replenish the red blood cells. So if you're an individual who's donating red marrow, to get to it, they have to go into the head of the femur or the humerus. And typically they use the femur because it's a larger head on the bone, and they can drill into it, suck out the marrow, and then they can use that as a bone marrow transplant. And of course, children are really good donors because they have a lot more red marrow than adults do. And so our main marrow is going to be yellow marrow. So our compact bone is very tough, and its job is to keep us upright and to be able to hold our weight. And so because of that, it's made of these structural units that look almost like columns put together, and they are known as the osteon. I tell people, to me, it reminds me of the pillars at the causeway as you're going to New Orleans, or the big bridge going across Lake Pontchartrain off of I-55. When you look at the bridge, it's sitting on top of these large columns which hold that bridge up. The osteons in our bone look very similar to that, and their job is to support and hold our weight up. So they are little or large cylinders that run down the length of our bone. And we have more than one osteon in each bone. And you saw them whenever you looked at the pictures of osseous tissue in Unit 2. It looked almost like, we said it looked kind of like pineapple rings. Each one of those rings was actually an osteon that you were looking at. And you were just looking at a cut of that osteon. So they're weight-bearing pillars. And they're very similar to the growth rings on a tree. But of course, you don't go count your osteon to see how old you are or anything like that. But they do look like, if you cut a tree down and you see the rings on a tree, the osteons look a lot like that. And each ring is sometimes called the lamella. And so because of that, you'll see in some textbooks, or maybe even a professor may refer to compact bone as lamellar bone because of that. Now, running through those osteons, it runs right down the middle as a little tunnel or little hallway, and that allows us to move blood vessels and nerve fibers through the osteon to give nutrients to that cylinder within the bone to keep it healthy and to provide, the ability to move and things like that. So that canal runs through there, and that is called the Haversian canal, sometimes known as the central canal because it runs through the core of the osteon. Now, running left and right, or perpendicular, you're going to find these Volkmann canal, and they're perforating canals because they move across each osteon. So they lie at right angles to the bone axis, and their job is to connect the blood from one osteon to the blood of another osteon, and to connect the nerve supplies to each osteon, so that way your bone acts as one whole unit or one whole organ. So here's a picture of these different canals. So first, let's look at the osteon. So you'll see right here this little cylinder, and you notice there's a couple that are pulled up here, and then you'll see one back here. That is your osteon. That's that weight-bearing pillar within your bone. So, and because you have many of them, because that gives you more support. Now, running down the middle, you'll see this little blood vessel running down the middle. That blood vessel is going to be your Haversian canal, or central canal, that allows the blood to run all the way down through the osteon. Now, going left and right, perpendicular to the osteon, you're going to find your Volkmann canal, and they perforate, and their job is to connect this osteon to that osteon so that the whole bone is getting the same nutrients and getting everything that it needs. And also there's going to be nerve fibers that run through this as well. So that way the bone is like one unit rather than an individual osteons. It's one whole unit that are all connected. Now, spongy bone's a little bit different. It consists of the trabeculae, which looks like Swiss cheese or looks like a sponge. And spongy bone, it will align itself around areas that need a little bit more support because of stress on that particular bone in that particular area. And the spongy bone is where you're going to find your medullary cavity. And so it gives a little support, but it's obviously not as strong as your compact bone is going to be. So what are your bones made of? Well, we've always seen as we're growing up, our parents probably told you, or your parents probably told you to drink your milk because milk makes your bones nice and healthy and strong, and they're right. But besides the mineral components, which we'll look at in just a second, your bones are living organs. And so that means they have an organic component too as well. So you're going to find cells within your bones. There's going to be osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. And each one of these are a type of cell that are specific to the bone that have a specific function within the bone. And then we have something called the osteoid, which is the matrix. Remember in the tissues, we talked about how tissues have a matrix. Well, the matrix for the bones is known as the osteoid. So that's its intercellular substance that we find around those cells within the bone. Also, our bone is made of a lot of minerals, mostly calcium, hence the reason why your parents told you to drink your milk, because milk has calcium and that allows your bones to be a lot stronger. And we're going to talk about why we need that calcium in just a few minutes. But the proper combination of all of your mineral salts allow your bones to last your entire lifetime and even beyond that. We find bones from individuals who've passed away because if those skeletal remains are protected from the elements, they can last for centuries. And so you can look at skeletons from years and years and years past, and it's because of those inorganic calcium or inorganic mineral salts that allow them to live or allows them to stay around for a very long period of time. Now, our bones will not be perfect. We find that throughout your life, maybe the way that you favor one foot over the other, or maybe you fell and broke a bone when you were little, or you've injured your skeletal system in some way. Bones have markings that are unique to the individual. I have like a little dent on my tibia on my right leg, and it's from where I got hit by a go-kart when I was little. And I can still feel that dent, that depression there. And that's a bone marking that is unique to me that you won't have. So there's several different kinds of bone markings, but the bone itself is going to be a very solid, very smooth structure. However, depending on the individual that skeleton belongs to, they may have markings that are unique to that individual because of something that happened in their life. So bones develop as we're babies, and we know that we come out, we're mainly cartilage, but we've got to change that bone or change that cartilage into bone, and that is called osteogenesis. I always tell people think in the beginning bone. So this is the process of making bone, sometimes known as ossification. Our bones get thick throughout our whole life, but the length does not grow for the rest of our life. We know that at a certain point you kind of tap out how tall you're going to be. For some of us, that's not very tall at all. For others, that's really tall. But for adults, we only make bone for repair when we reach adulthood. So the only bone we really grow is when we need to repair maybe a fracture, or our body is putting more bone into an area that maybe gets too much stress on that particular area of the skeleton. At week 8, our skeletons, this is when your mom was pregnant with you, you can see the skeleton, but it's mainly fibrous membranes and cartilage. If you've ever seen an ultrasound of someone when they first find out they're pregnant, that little embryo that you see on that ultrasound doesn't really look like a person, and you don't really see much of their skeleton. You may see the vertebral column, and you may see the very beginnings of rib cage, but that skeleton's very light, and that's because it's mainly fibrous material. It's not that hardened skeletal material like we think of. Once you reach week 8, and then you go in for another ultrasound, you'll start to see bones begin to form. Now remember, bones are still kind of pliable at this age, so there's not the same kind of bones that we have now. We will let you know when it's time to release bus riders. Thank you. As we grow up during infancy and youth, the bones will continue to lengthen at the growth plate. But once we reach that final stage in our life where we're not growing anymore, then our bones will stop growing at that point, and then we just go to thickening at that point. So bone homeostasis, because of course we want to keep our skeleton protected and we want to keep it healthy, we actually recycle anywhere between 5 to 7% of our bone mass every year. So spongy bone is usually completely replaced over the course of 3 to 4 years. So we'll go through and we recycle out our bone mass, however much of that bone mass there is. We'll recycle it every 3 to 4 years. And then for compact bone, typically it's replaced about every 10 years. So the skeleton you have now in 2020 will be different from the skeleton you have in 2030. For us to keep our bone mass constant, that means for every bit of bone that we absorb, we have to deposit that same amount. So if we take out so many grams of bone during our recycling, we have to put back that same amount of bone when we deposit that bone back. So bone deposit occurs all throughout our life, especially when a bone's injured. It allows us to add more strength. You may know somebody who's broken a bone and had to go back in later on to have bone deposits removed because that bone has gone through a bone deposit in that area because your body just assumes that it needs more strength in that area. And so we'll put in more bone as needed. But if we're not replacing the bone, that needs to be replaced when we're not injured, our skeleton won't be strong. So for our body to stay strong, we need to make sure that we keep our calcium intake up. And so, even if you don't drink milk, there's other ways to get calcium. There's, yogurt, there's ice cream, cheese. And of course, if you can't eat any of those things, then you can always take calcium supplements to make sure that your body is getting the amount of calcium that it needs. But of course, you need to speak to your doctor to find out just how much calcium you should be taking in because you can take too much calcium. And some people can't tolerate a lot of calcium. So there's a few homeostatic imbalances that I want to look at real quick. There's 3 of them that we're going to learn in this part. The first one is called osteomalacia. Osteomalacia is known as soft bones. Basically, these children lack adequate minerals, and it causes them that as their torso gets heavier, it pushes down on their legs, and their legs never had hardened, so they begin to bow. So they may bow in like this child on the left, or they may bow out like the child on the right. We know it as rickets. We don't see rickets very much now in the United States, and that's because one of the things that we do really well in the U.S. is we make sure that children get adequate nutrition. Your school lunch, for example, it may not be your favorite thing in the world to eat, but it's packed with the nutrients that are needed so that children who maybe don't get adequate nutrition at home, they're at least getting 2 nutritious meals during the school week. So rickets is what we call this. And what would happen is because it's very painful and it can damage the hips, when these children are older, they would have to go in, break their legs, and they would have to straighten them. Osteoporosis, what happens here is that bone resorption outpaces bone deposit. So your bones are very porous and light. We see this in a lot of postmenopausal women. So their bones break really, really, really easily. And then the last one is known as Paget's disease. And Paget's disease, this is going to be a genetic disorder. And what happens is you just form bone too fast, too much. And so the bone is not strong enough and it's very spotty. So that means if you bump them or they fall, they can break bones very, very easily. So that's it for today's lesson. I'm sorry for all the interruptions, but if you'll go back and review through your part 1 lectures that you've done so far, we have one more lecture and we'll be finishing up part 1.